good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Wonderful to see so many people joining us from around the world. And a formal welcome to you all to this event, our Magna Carta Observatory Conference on University Values and Responsibilities, the subheading Responding to the Challenges of the Future. Many people, I'm sure, on the call have attended anniversary conferences of the Magna Carta Universitatum before, and will remember what wonderful events those are in person. Obviously, we would have loved to do this event in person, but very pleased to be able to do it on Zoom in any case. The particular thing to celebrate this time, of course, is the launch of the Magna Carta Universitatum 2020. The work of a group of drafting people and the fruit of a long period of international consultation, which brought us to the document which will be signed tomorrow. A strange thing to complete all that work and then to be delayed by COVID in the signing of it. But we've decided to persist, and hence we're all gathered today and tomorrow to reflect on the state of universities worldwide, the challenges they face, the principles enshrined in the Magna Carta Universitatum, and the directions which those values should steer us in the future. So thank you very much for joining us. Just a couple of points, if I may. One is to note that this event is being delivered in association with the University of Bologna, with Unibo, our long-standing partner in the work of the observatory, and very pleased to continue that partnership in the future. Just a reminder too, the event is being recorded, and to everyone, I'm sure you all know the Zoom protocol by now, to please keep yourselves muted and your cameras off, unless you're invited to ask a question. That will ensure a high quality meeting for everybody. So I'm going to plunge right into our first session, if I may. The heading for the session is Environmental Changes since 1988 and Challenges to the Future, a Global Perspective. We have two outstanding speakers today, both of whom I think will be known to a number of people on the call. Jamil Salmi, who's the higher education consultant with the World Bank. He's the World Bank Tertiary Education Coordinator, and you'll find a biography of Jamil Salmi in the background document that was provided to you. Our second keynote speaker is Michael Ignatieff, President and Rector of the Central European University in Hungary, presently operating out of Austria. Again, there's a biography for Michael in the background document. I'm not going to elaborate on our two speakers' qualifications and distinguished careers, other than to note that Jamil Salmi has most recently brought out a book on tertiary education and the Sustainable Development Goals. This, I would guess, will be a theme that will come up numerous times in our discussions today and tomorrow. Michael, a very distinguished author of 17 books and someone who's written very extensively on international development and the international responsibilities of Western nations. So we're very privileged to have our two speakers with us today. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Jamil Salmi to offer his keynote address. We'll then move directly into Michael Ignatieff's talk, and then we can take questions for both our speakers in the period that follows. So perhaps I could hand over to Jamil Salmi then.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your kind introduction. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. It is really a great honor for me to be part of this very important event. And I feel very humbled by this opportunity. And I would like to start by evoking 4 dates with you: 1988, 89, 1994, and 2010, because I believe that the 4 events related to these dates were symbolic of democracy on the march. First, with the publication of the Magna Carta, a year later with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that gave us a promise of democracy for all former Soviet Union republics and Eastern Europe. 1994, the end of apartheid, promising democracy in South Africa. And 2010, the beginning of the Arab Spring in Tunisia and beyond, with also the hope of democracy in that part of the world. Against this background, I have divided my presentation into 3 parts. I would like to start talking about major changes in the higher education landscape over the past 30 years, and then briefly evoke the COVID-19 shock before moving to talking about what is ahead of us. How will university in the post-pandemic order operate, and what is their new mission? For the first part, I would like to evoke major trends, and there are many more that I could have talked about, but my time is limited. First, demographics and resources. Second, the knowledge economy and the 4.0 revolution. I want to talk about advanced technology for higher education, the global rankings, and the post-truth era. This graph will show you, as you know better than me, that in most countries in the world, higher education enrollment have really soared over the past 30 years. And there are perhaps 3 points to make in that context. First, that while it is a trend in most countries in the world, which has also allowed to improve equity in higher education, with more people, more students from low-income countries and from low-income groups, from more girls, more students from minorities. At the same time, a demographic trend of concern in Europe generally, not only Eastern Europe, where it is more marked, but also in some Western European countries and beyond Europe, in East Asian countries, for example, in South Korea. You will see that also in Taiwan, a reduction in the size of the new cohorts of young people, which may be a problem for many universities. A second issue related is that we've had the 2007-8 economic crisis. And since then, public resources for higher education has decreased significantly in many countries. And those of you who live in these countries will know the situation. Second dimension, the knowledge economy. You may recognize the Prime Minister of Norway, Mrs. Erna Solberg, who astonished her fellow citizens in one of her first speeches. So the point I wanted to make about Erna Solberg is that in her speech, you know that Norway has built its wealth on oil and gas, and she told them we need to forget about oil because knowledge is the oil of the future. And I think that is symbolic of the recognition by many countries that universities are at the heart of economic growth, not only the Nordic countries, but the so-called Asian tigers and dragons. And Europe, with its Lisbon agenda, has committed itself to becoming the most dynamic knowledge economy in the world, which has resulted in increased funding for research, the Horizon 2020 being one example. But then we have seen a big change in the economy and the labor markets due to large parts to these friendly or perhaps less friendly characters. The robots using artificial intelligence, machine learning, automatization, etc., which puts universities in the dilemma, because you have to ask yourself, are you training your students for jobs of today that most likely are going to disappear very soon? Or are you trying to train them for the jobs of tomorrow, except that you may not know what these jobs are? So this is a big dilemma. Are you training? How are you preparing young professionals whose life will be one of moving from one profession to the other 5, 6, 7 times over their career? I'm not talking about different firms or it's totally different jobs. Perhaps we can take 30-second breathing stop and look at this nice mountain that inspires peace and tranquility. But if you come nearer, you will hear a rumble announcing an avalanche, as this report from the Pearson Foundation announced maybe 8 years ago. An avalanche is coming to higher education. They were referring to technology. You may remember that 2012 Time magazine said that this was a year MOOC, announcing the end, perhaps, of universities as endangered species, that all these new technologies would make traditional universities and on-campus learning totally obsolete. And then if some of you are movie fans like me, you may remember Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. What we have seen now is rise of the edtechs, and resulting in unbundling and heavy disruption for traditional universities. And here, and I'm not going to go through the whole list of what edtechs are involved in now. The digital infrastructure and platforms, e-learning software, getting involved in assessment, not only plagiarism check or proctoring of exams, credentialing and badging, etc., etc. And then we have the phenomenon of the rankings. And it all started there in Shanghai at the Center for World-Class Universities. Look at these 3 innocent-looking gentlemen. Little did they realize when they launched the academic ranking of world universities in 2003, how many nightmares they would cause among university professors, presidents, rectors, vice chancellors, as we all know. And there was this article in the late mid 2000 called "A Thin Line Between Love and Hate," and I think that summarizes very well our feelings towards the rankings. And but it's true, whether we like it or not, they have in many corners of the world become the new compass for heads of states, for ministers of higher education, and for university leaders. Today, the rankings are seen as a proxy of performance of universities and higher education systems. It has become a stake of national pride. And as you know, many countries have launched so-called excellence initiatives to try to push some of their best universities to emerge as world-class universities. In some countries, we've seen a big incentive for universities to merge. In some countries, and you will know which ones, we've seen forced mergers. In others, we've seen the conformation of artificial conglomerate universities, where you would have an umbrella universities, and within these universities, other universities, which I find very strange, but maybe that helps with the rankings. And what I call the ranking disease, with the global brain race to try to attract the best researchers from other universities, from other countries. An increasingly narrow focus on research, the so-called publish or perish culture, so prevalent in many universities. And then you see policies based on the basis of rankings. You can get scholarships to go to do your PhD abroad only if you go in the top 100 universities. Some countries have accelerated visa schemes for people who are graduates of top universities, university presidents deciding on the partnerships or even whom to meet only if that university is in the top 100. And recently in Ireland, 2 universities have gone to court, one of them accusing the other of poaching one of its best professors. Last but not least, we have entered, sadly, what people have called the post-truth era, about fake news, conspiracy theories, alternative truths. President Bush used to say, I don't care what the facts say. Or at the beginning of President Trump's presidency, we are glad to present you with alternative facts. And sometimes we may disagree with the facts. And so, alongside teaching evolution in your biology classes, you will also have to teach creationism, because this is an alternative version of science that has to be respected. And perhaps you want to attend the next Flat Earth International Conference. I was very sad when I realized that a former Minister of Education in the UK during the Brexit campaign could make claims that we were fed up of listening to experts, to university professors, to their scientific theories. And isn't it symbolic and paradoxal that at the beginning of the pandemic, the two countries with the largest numbers of Nobel Prize winners in medicine, the US and the UK, also had the largest numbers of COVID deaths, showing the total divorce between scientific evidence provided by universities and policy making in these countries. And I've just mentioned the COVID-19 shock. Back in 2012, the president of Stanford University, President Hennessy, announced a tsunami about to hit the world of universities. And even though he lives in California, he was not referring to a water tsunami, but to universities in the digital era. Nobody paid attention to his speech. And yet, when COVID-19 arrived, haven't we experienced the biggest disruption of the world of universities in the history of universities, with 200 million students moving very quickly from on-campus learning to online learning? And many of us, digital dinosaurs, to adapt, sometimes within a week, sometimes within a few days, to this new world. Some of us have done it with enthusiasm, but many more with reluctance or with fear of the unknown. And I believe that this small drawing summarizes better than many words what happened in 2020. We started on the left and moving back towards the right, this experience. And I would like to summarize what we have experienced under COVID with three ideas. First of all, we have seen an exacerbation of disparities across countries, across universities, and among the students. And then we've seen also an acceleration of innovations on the positive side, and also an increased recognition of the scientific role of universities. Very quickly, a few images to illustrate. This student in Chile climbing on top of the roof at the risk of her life, because this is the only place where she can have access to the internet. We've seen disparities in terms of access, disparity in terms of learning outcomes at the end of the year. Just within a few months, 50,000 French students had dropped out because of problems of internet connection and economic resources. And now we're going to see disparities in terms of labor market outcomes for the graduates of the 2020 cohort. I believe that these two pictures, which was featured on the New York Times, capture it also very well. These two students were enrolled in the same posh college in the US, and then they have to go back home. And you can see the huge difference, symbolic of the socioeconomic differences in background. On campus, they were alike, but now the one on the left, Isabel, is back to her posh house, and the one on the right, Tatiana, is helping her parents with their food truck in Florida. Will they have had the same educational experience? Certainly not. But on the positive side, as I mentioned, we've seen many education innovations. Professors realizing that just recording their lecture, putting it online was not sufficient. So finding ways to engage their students through active and interactive learning, moving more towards experiential learning through the multidisciplinary approaches, problem-based, competency-based simulations, and of course, having to align assessment to these new approaches. Of course, this is the opposite of doing innovative assessment. This is a picture from Turkey, where the university, whose name shall remain anonymous today, they sent 11,000 mirrors to their students. You can see the mirror at the bottom right-hand side, so that they could observe and control what the students were doing, that they were not cheating during the exam. No, innovative assessment mean daring to allow students to use their textbooks, have access to online, and giving exams that really will test how the students apply their critical thinking, problem-solving skills, rather than rote memory. And the last point about COVID is the positive contribution of universities everywhere in terms of research, epidemiology, modeling, genome sequencing, COVID-19 tests, treatment and vaccine, production of medical products and equipment, hundreds and thousands of medical and nursing students, even before graduating, going to the emergency rooms, being in the front line, many of them losing their lives, and providing scientific advice to governments and the public, where, especially in some countries where there was no keen interest. Later today, I believe tomorrow, we'll be hearing President Marcelo Knobel from Unicamp, one of the top universities in Brazil, who was telling me how the struggle, he had the courage to close down his university, who was the first one on March 12 in Brazil, was criticized by everybody, government, his colleagues. Mind you, within a week, all universities has closed down. And they've been doing so much I know he's very humble, so he will not tell you himself, but they've been at the forefront in providing scientific advice and advocating the use of vaccines and using scientific evidence about COVID, even having to defend the fact, no, the Earth is not flat. So with this background, how do we prepare for the post-pandemic order? Very briefly, I will mention 3 dimensions. I believe there is a need for a new education model, a new economic model, and our renewed social commitment, which is what the Magna Carta is all about. New education model. We have to move away from a teacher-centered pedagogy to a student-centered pedagogy, applying what the title of this beautiful book implies in terms of renewed approach, sparking passion and unleashing genius in every student, making the content experiential and linked to the sustainable development goals, moving away from summative evaluation to formative evaluation that can be fed back into the pedagogical process, accepting that we may want to have a blended mode of delivery, both on campus and online, and not forgetting what we have been paying lip service to, lifelong learning, but which very few universities have seriously embraced. I believe that this pyramid symbolizes the shape of most of universities. And my prediction, for many years, I've been saying that we should move towards a star-shaped university where education for young people would be an important part, but not the only one. Continuing professional development and career change studies would also be very important, with a hybrid approach on campus, online, itinerant universities, etc. A new economic model. We have seen the fragility. We knew about the structural imbalances, but we postponed facing them until COVID-19 hit us in the face. We need a stronger and sustained financial commitment from governments, but at the same time, diversified funding to avoid overdependence on the state, or in the case of private universities, on households, or in the case of countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or even the US, dependence on international students that cross-subsidize your domestic students. Why do we have in the same city so many universities with not talking to each other, with walls, not sharing their scientific infrastructure, their academics? The COVID-19 has revealed how we could collaborate virtually. Why don't we apply that even after COVID? Not forgetting to include risk analysis and contingency planning in the management of our universities. And the last dimension, perhaps the most important one, the need for a new social model that will support equity, truth, ethics, and social commitment. Equity first. We pay lip service, but are we really committed? I always use this quote from Richard Toney, the impertinent courtesy of an invitation offered to unwelcome guests, the certainty that circumstances will prevent them from accepting. Equity is about promoting genuine inclusion and diversity to low-income students, the various gender groups, minorities, immigrant population, refugees, the Romas in Eastern Europe, students with disabilities. We have seen so many examples of elitist universities that are still closed, even when they admit students from low-income families, for example. The hidden institutional culture is so different that these students do not at home. Just two slides, 2 or 3 to illustrate. The likelihood of attending tertiary education linked to your parents' education. So if your parents have been to university, you have a much higher probability of going to higher education, except in the truly equal countries like South Korea, Finland, basically the Nordic countries that have a low probability. So it doesn't make a big difference whether your parents have gone to university or not. But for the OECD, as an average, 4.5, which is very, and then countries like Switzerland, UK, 6. If your parents have been to university, the probability is 6 times higher than if your parents did not attend universities. Here are some statistics from Romania, whether you have an important Roma population. So graduation rates for secondary education is 65% for the general population, but only 7% if you are from the Roma population. And for higher education, it's 30% from the general population, less than 1% if you are a Roma youth. And then even though we have made a lot of progress on gender in most of the world, except South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, we most often have more girls than boys enrolled in higher education. But in terms of senior academics, the proportion of women will be much smaller. In terms of girls in STEM programs, much smaller. In the US, for example, it's only 25%. And look at the statistics from the European University Association. These are statistics from their universities showing the proportion of universities headed by a lady. And the average for Europe is still less than 15%. You have a few countries that don't have one female rector or university president or vice chancellor today. And while we have pioneers like Austria or again the Nordic countries with 30%, we still have very small percentages in other countries. And then it's about speaking the truth. I want to remind us of what Bertrand Russell said. The whole problem of the world, fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubt. And the wise people in university must go out and share the truth. Umberto Eco, the Italian writer, wrote a few years back, social media networks have given a voice to legions of fools who before would speak only at local pubs and would not harm the community. Back then, they would be silenced immediately, while today they have the same right to speak as the Nobel Prize winner. Universities foster the truth by preparing students to learn about how the use of scientific evidence, about critical thinking and truth thinking. This is today even more important than before. And that's also linked to academic freedom, which unfortunately is suffering every year more. From Scholar at Risk Statistics, the report for 2020, we see that even countries that are supposedly democratic are imposing growing restriction in some universities. And here is from their publication: Canada, Chile, Colombia, France, Greece, Hungary, Mexico, Russia, Spain, Turkey, UK, US. We've seen very dramatic events with the closure of the attack on the Central European universities in Hungary, and I will not speak more about it since we have the pleasure of having its president with us today, or even in Russia, in St. Petersburg. We have in Hungary, it is forbidden by law to do gender studies, or in some countries we have attack on race studies or study of colonialism, even in democracies like France or Denmark, with the recent attack on Islamo-Gauchism in France, or against gender studies by the Danish parliament recently. Third and penultimate dimension, ethics. As the Belgian philosopher reminded us, doesn't a great power require an education that leaves space to doubt, philosophy, and a long ethical initiation? Universities are not only about preparing professionals, but perhaps mostly about fostering positive values, honesty, tolerance, open-mindedness, and solidarity. It's also about combating cheating. We've seen a growing number of examples where even the ministers in charge of education would be disqualified because of plagiarism. Online cheating has been a big worry during COVID. And universities everywhere must be much less complacent about sexual harassment. Last but not least, social commitment, ensuring that the content of our curriculum, the focus of our research, is about relevance to the big challenges of our century, about achieving the sustainable development goals, about sustainability, having a green campus, divestment from fossil fuel, and reckoning with the past. I will take just one example. Last week in Canada, or 2 weeks ago, the bodies of more than 200 children were found. Were in these special residential schools for indigenous children. I am a big friend of Ryerson University, one of the great universities, rising universities in Canada. But Mr. Ryerson was the person behind this shameful policy, and now there is a call to change the name, or at least recognize what his name means. And a growing number of universities in the UK, in Australia and Canada are trying to face up to their colonial past, to the way they've been treating indigenous people in their country. And I think that's a very important dimension. In conclusion, sadly, the optimism that we saw in the late 80s may not be appropriate today when we see democracy in retreat. The democracy index of The Economist shows us that 2020 has been a very bad year in many parts of the world. And I think that we need to live today more than ever with this VUCA concept. We are living in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Think about our students. Before, they had a path well traced ahead of them. They would study and would graduate. What's going to happen to the 2020 graduates? And universities need really to help students cope with these dimensions that are very challenging. So you need to think about your plan for the post-COVID. And I think the priorities as first to keep the university community safe. Sadly, and I will not mention them, but we've seen countries where for ideological reasons, or for economic reasons, universities have rushed to reopen their gates when it was still not safe for their community. You need to reimagine your university from an education point of view, rethink your economic model, and deepen your social commitment on behalf of equity, truth, and sustainability. I finish with three quotes, food for thought for all of us. First of all, from the scientist Mark Bekoff, the plural of anecdotes is data. Scientific evidence is so important. Second, as Samuel Johnson told us many centuries ago, integrity without knowledge is weak and useless, but knowledge without integrity is dangerous and dreadful. And finally, the positive words from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And that is why your Magna Carta is so important, because you are small groups of university leaders with university communities, but together you represent such a powerful force to promote equity, truth, ethics, and sustainability.
Thanks very much, Jamil. An absolutely wonderful talk, and so much food there for thought. And I'm sure there will be many questions for you after that presentation. Thanks very much. And I think what I really admired about it was the frankness with which you explored the obstacles, but also found the right grounds for optimism where that seems appropriate. So we will come to questions later on, and I would encourage everyone, if they have questions for Jamil or for Michael, to put them into the chat, and we will do our best to put those to our speakers in the latter part of the session. So I'll now hand over to Michael Ignatieff for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And here's what I do to Jamil. Thank you, Jamil. That was great. I'm going to be different. I don't have any slides. I don't like slides. I mean, Jamil's slides were terrific. Any slide with Samuel Johnson on it is fine by me. So I like the slides, but I don't generally use them. I just talk to you. I am going to pick up some themes that Jamil raised, themes about academic freedom. I'm going to situate my remarks in the context of something that he referred to briefly, which is the internationalization of higher education. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto in 1965, we had very few international students. Now, international students from hundreds of countries are a common feature of our educational programs everywhere. The internationalization of education has been an extraordinary story, and it was a story that we thought would promote democracy, would promote understanding, would promote interconnection between peoples. And the way it's played out has been a little bit more complicated. My university, Central European University, was founded in 1991 by George Soros, a multi-billionaire Holocaust survivor from Hungary, on the premise, which I think is important, that there's a connection between democracy and universities. That is, as a country comes out of communism, what it needs, as much as it needs a new constitution, is new universities. If you had universities that were called Karl Marx University of Economics, you kind of know what they were teaching, and it was important, therefore, Soros felt, to create a university that taught a social science and humanities curriculum that was open to the best scholarship and the most open debate in the world. And that's why Soros founded a university in Hungary 30 years ago. And it is a small place. Many of you run universities that would swallow up mine in a heartbeat. We have about 1,300 students, a couple of hundred faculty. We're proud of our research intensity and our global rankings and all the usual blah, 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 but we are a small place. And we were minding our own P's and Q's because we understood, as I think everybody on this call understands, that there's a very strong distinction between a university and an NGO or a political organization. A university has no business intervening in the politics of its native countries, but we were an aspect of the internationalization of education. We were an American university granting American degrees in Central and Eastern Europe and trying to set a model for post-secondary education in this region as it came out of communist tyranny. And that was part of a much bigger story, the expansion of American higher education everywhere, Abu Dhabi, Middle East, China, Singapore, all over the world. And many of you were part of that in the sense that there are great British institutions establishing satellite campuses. And then all of us experienced a tremendous inflow of foreign students from all over the world. And for a time, I think, particularly in the 90s, the turn of the century, this sense that the university was kind of the United Nations of the world. The whole world was in our classroom, was tremendously exciting and tremendously inspiring, and promised, in fact, that we could make a difference, in fact, to the democratic transition of the whole world. I remember being in the Kennedy School classroom with wonderful Chinese students and feeling with these Chinese students being exposed to the full, vigorous, highly contentious debate in our classrooms that, hey, some of this would rub off and they'd go back to China. Nobody ever thought that the great Chinese people want to imitate the United States, but they might take out some of the pluralism, some of the debate, some of the stand up on your feet and be counted stuff that we felt was what was so great about international education and what we at CU and many of you are trying to do in your campuses. If you fast forward to the present day, and here I'd pick up things that Jamil has said, we're in a very different context. And that's why I'm not going to tell you the whole story of CU at length. That seems a little bit self-important. I simply want to refer to CU as an exemplar of a wider trend. But I think, as many of you know, we were doing fine in Hungary, and suddenly, out of the blue, the prime minister of the country decided to introduce legislation in parliament that made it effectively illegal for us to issue US degrees. After much public battling, and one episode that I do want you all to notice, we had a demonstration in our favor, which we had nothing to do with in terms of organizing it, in May 2017, in which 80,000 Hungarians walked through the streets of Budapest chanting the following slogan: "Free universities for a free society." Sums it up perfectly. That's our mission statement, it seems to me: free universities for a free society. And they were saying, we don't have free universities and we don't have a free society. And that has remained true in 2020. Notice that this is occurring in a society that's nominally democratic. It's a society with a great tradition of freedom. It's a society with high levels of post-secondary education. But he has got away with the expulsion of a university from the national territory of a European member state and a NATO state. And he's got away with it despite more speeches than I've had, hot dinners from influential politicians around the world. What message do I draw from that? And I think it's relevant to every rector in the room. When you get hit, you're on your own. You've got to be able to cultivate a domestic constituency, because the international constituency won't help you, especially during the Trump era when we had no support from the American government. I mention these geostrategic issues because I think it's important for university presidents to understand how much their freedom, their capacity to act, depends on an international context. And when that international context turns adverse, you can lose your freedom. The point of this saga is not to make you feel sorry for CEU. CEU is fine. We're now moved to Vienna. We're just establishing a new campus there, and we look forward to having wonderful and cooperative relations with many of you in the years ahead. But there are a few lessons from this story that I think are relevant. One of them, irrelevant particularly to European universities, is that we discovered that the language of European law and constitutional law and European treaty law is terribly weak in the defense of academic freedom. Education is allowed to be within the domain of nation states. If nation states want to throw a university out, there's not a tremendous amount of law that the European Commission or European Parliament can reach to defend universities. So that's just a thing everybody needs to wake up. We're much more vulnerable than we suppose to authoritarian single-party rulers. We even got a favorable judgment of the European Court of Justice saying the law that threw us out of Hungary was entirely contrary to European law. Didn't help us. So again, these are unpleasant facts that I think need to be borne in mind by everybody who may be in the dreamland of supposing that Europe is going to save you if your national government leans on you, or that the United States is going to save you. So those are a few thoughts about the ways in which academic freedom and its correlate, institutional autonomy, turn out to be much less secure, in my judgment, than we like to think. And you need to assess the political terrain in your country very carefully to ensure that you can guarantee the institutional autonomy and academic freedom of your institutions. The other aspect of the Hungarian story, which I hope is of general interest, is that Orbán threw us out, and guess who he invited in? Fudan University. Now, I don't want to be part, I don't know whether there are any of our Chinese colleagues on the call, I don't want to be part of any Cold War rhetoric about China. But the reality is Fudan University explicitly acknowledges the ultimate authority of the Communist Party of China. And I think if they come in to Budapest, there are a lot of things that might be good for Hungary to have a Chinese university. But there's one thing you can take to the bank. There will not be classes at Fudan University critical of Chinese government or Chinese foreign policy. And you can bet that there will be no classes in Hungary or in Fudan or anywhere else that are critical of Hungarian policy. So if you bring in a Chinese university and the Hungarian people are being asked to pay $1.5 billion to sustain this adventure in international education, this has profound implications for academic freedom across Europe as a whole. And I think this allows me then to trampoline to another issue, which is related, and it's all connecting to the internationalization of higher education and some unexpected things that have happened along the way. As I say, I think it's wonderful that we have students from 130, 40 countries in our classrooms at CU, and I'm sure you have people from lots of countries in yours. But one of the disturbing aspects that has become apparent recently is the ways in which these foreign students are under surveillance by their home governments. This is notorious in the case of Chinese students. I've had Chinese students when I was teaching at Harvard come up to me and say, well, there's lots of things I'd like to say in your class, Prof, but that guy, the other Chinese guy in the class makes reports on us. We just have to wake up about this. We have to be aware that there is a silencing effect in international education that is coming, in fact, from the state security services of Turkey, of China, of Russia, a number of other places. And we need to be aware of the silent pressure that this puts on our students. If you think Michael Ignatieff has sort of suddenly got a little crazy here or a little paranoid, I promise you I'm not. As we speak, I have a very good student in his late 20s called Ahmed Samir Santawi, who's doing a master's degree in social anthropology at my university, who's in the slammer in prison in Cairo. What is his offense? He went home to do some research for his master's thesis and was arrested at the airport for comments he may or may not have made on his Facebook page that may or may not have been critical of the Egyptian government. Well, there are a couple thousand Egyptian students in Europe, maybe at some of your universities. The effect of this is immediate. They then think, I better be careful what I say on my Facebook page. And if there's another Egyptian student in my class, I ought to be a little careful about that because I just don't know whether he's talking to somebody back home. This emerging element of threat to academic freedom is not often discussed because in our mindsets, there's the idea that our academic freedom is safe and secure, and somewhere else in China, in Russia, in some other country far away, there's a threat to the academic freedoms that we here can take for granted. And I'm trying to shake up that pattern a little. I still think our academic freedoms are robust. They are the core of our ethics as a university. They are not merely a procedure. They're what we live by. If we don't have freedom in the classroom, I'm not sure what we're doing. And here I try to identify a couple of places where I think there are some threats that we need to take carefully. I will say just one more thing. I will not get into the vexed and tormented debate that you see in the United States, you see in Great Britain, as universities struggle to reckon with difficult pasts. In my country, Canada, we've toppled the statue of the founder of our country, John A. Macdonald, because of his association with something that Jamil referred to, which is his association with the Aboriginal schools. In Bristol, statues of slave owners are being tipped into harbors. In a common room in England, to my utter amazement, the Queen is being removed from a common room at a very wealthy and ancient college because she's a symbol of colonialism and therefore might be unwelcome to foreign students. All of this is, if you look at it, places our students and our faculty in a force field of public debate about how we reckon with painful pasts. And I, as a rector, of course, welcome that. But there is a negative side to this, which I think is constraining to freedom. And the constraint is we're then obliged by some mysterious movement in the ether to say a certain kind of happy talk about all these issues out of fear of offending powerful interests and powerful forces among our student body and among our faculty body. And I feel that I am working in an academic environment more constraining of freedom than at any time in my adult life. I say this carefully because, frankly, I've loved being in academic life, but I can't remember a time when my academic freedom wasn't slightly constrained by some fashionable bit of jargon. When I was 21, it was Marxism. Then when I was 30, it was structuralism. Then when I was 35, it was post-structuralism. And then it was some other bit of nonsense imported from some foreign university. And the problem everywhere was how to preserve our sovereignty as thinking individuals. So I don't think the current climate is new, but I think it is a recurring drama for every one of us as university leaders to push back, create a space in which we can listen to each other, in which the complexity of reckoning with the past can be done, in which the complexity of living together across race, class, religion can be worked through. That's what universities are for. And at the moment, instead of having that full and fulsome debate, we're kind of reduced into a kind of clenched, uneasy silence here, which I think is dangerous to our future. I'm going to stop now. I've gone on a little longer than I intended. I've tried to describe what's happened to international education. I've tried to describe some of the external pressures that are weighing in on academic freedom across the world, and tried to use Central European University as an example of some of those pressures. And then I've concluded by looking at some of the internal pressures on academic freedom that concern me as someone who loves universities, love what we do, believe more passionately in what we do than ever, like Jamil, but want to preserve that space of freedom that is essentially our most important contribution to society. I thank you all for your attention. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a really stimulating set of remarks about critically important issues. So a reminder to everybody to put your questions into the chat, and I'll bring those forward for our speakers. Perhaps I could begin by putting a question to both of you, and that has to do with the question of how we protect our institutions against some of these challenges. Jamil at the start spoke about the importance of the universities being essentially safe to pursue their mission, and Michael's worked through a number of critical issues which threaten that safety. So I wonder if you could reflect on practical measures to be taken. Michael, you spoke about pushing back, against whom, and I'd be interested in the thoughts both of you might have about how universities should negotiate their relationship with government, where that is potentially the source of protection, but also potentially the source of constraint and inroads on academic freedom. Michael, why don't I go to you first and then to Jamil?
Well, I think my one-word answer is get political, although that's a provocative answer and is said by a failed former politician. So I've been a government elsewhere on that. I just think that, you know, in the case of Hungary, if I had to redo it again, I would have done more work with the Hungarian political system to try and see whether I can find some friends. We did a lot of that. It wasn't enough. I'm now in a new context in Vienna. I spent a lot of my time just explaining to people who we are, where we are, and how we want to proceed. All of us have a political role to play. And I think the other thing is that we're in a continual, and this is particularly true of those of you who run state-funded institutions, we're in a perpetual, unending process of public self-justification. And that seems to me entirely appropriate. If the citizens of our country pay for all us fancy people to have the wonderful lives we have to give a very good, constant, unending story about what we do for society as a whole. And I think the universities, by and large, have a good story. Jamil made the point that without university research and university science, a hell of a lot more people would be dead right now than they were. It's thanks to university science and the incredible way in which university science, just stopped everything to try and get control of this pandemic. It's the best example I know of what we do contribute, but we need to fight back. We need to enter the terrain. And when populist politicians tell us, we need to hear a lot fewer experts, we need to say, au contraire. I'm sorry, you're flying blind without what we know. You're flying blind without what the kind of patient, dedicated social science, natural science research that we do. And it's here, it's a public good, it's for you. So stop these stupid arguments about how elitist and out of touch we are. We are here to serve the societies that fund us and support us. And but we have to take this burden of self-justification deadly seriously and never for a second rest inside our ivory towers. Jamil will have more to say about that, I'm sure.
Yes, Michael. Jamil.
Well, first of all, I fully agree with all the points that Michael has just mentioned. And perhaps another dimension that is important is also to be transparent about the relationship between the university and government, and university and financial interests. One of the participants in the chat challenged us to think also about commodification, marketization of higher education, that with reduced public funding, increased dependence on non-public funding, and sometimes you have to make deals with the devil. And even a university that I admire tremendously, MIT, has recently been in the spotlight because they had received money from Jeffrey Epstein. They had received money from the Saudi government. And I think the point was that it was not very transparent. And I would contrast that with University of Hong Kong, when they, even though it was a rich public university, and I'm talking about 20 years ago, but they started doing fundraising, but with very clear principles. So they would, for example, not accept money from companies producing arms or tobacco products, etc. So I think you have to define the rules of engagement. From whom will you accept donations? From whom will you accept research money, etc. Just a few points. Yes, I agree with Michael. You want to engage more with the politics and the political sphere, but I mean, sadly, we've seen the limits of that, and I think two examples are Brazil and the US under Trump, where all of a sudden you have a sorry if I'm going to use this word, but a crazy president or a dangerous president who will institutional freedom and academic freedom and institutional autonomy of universities. So on the positive side, I think that we've seen much more solidarity, collaboration within countries and across countries as a result of COVID. And hopefully this movement will not die away as we go back to some kind of normal life. I think maybe, Michael, you mentioned that with all even the European Court intervening, that may not have swayed the Hungarian government, but from where I sit, I can see that there is definitely a terrible stain on the reputation of Hungary and its higher education system as a result of what happened to your university. That may not be much comfort to you, but I still think that it's this community of the academic community that is really international and can mobilize itself to protect academic freedom and institutional autonomy. And I think we have to remember that all your graduates, all the students and the graduates will be the best ambassadors if you do the things that you recommended, if you and that I tried also to push, that we get graduates who are not only strong professionals, but good citizens and who share the values that are in the Magna Carta.
Thanks very much, Jamil. I see we've got a number of questions coming up in the chat. So if you do have questions, please write them out in the chat and I'll call on you. Could I maybe go to Tony Gallagher's question, which is an interesting question about, I suppose it's about the climate of freedom on campus. And he makes an interesting distinction between what happens in the lecture hall, where to some extent discussion is constrained, I suppose, by the shape of thinking or prevailing thinking in the discipline, and what can happen on the campus at large, and wonders if there are sort of different criteria or standards that apply in those two venues. And he'd addressed the question, I think, to Michael in the first instance. So Michael, why don't I go to you?
Tony, I think it's a good question, a challenging one. The contrast I see in the lecture hall is that you should speak only about what you know within the context of the discipline and within the context of the course that you're teaching. I think it's inappropriate in a classroom to wear your political heart on your sleeve. I taught a lot of people at the Kennedy School who you learn very quickly, lived in different moral and mental universes. You'd have a hijab wearing Iranian female student sitting next door, right next to a colonel in the United States military back from Iraq. I mean, that's what it was like. And so in those contexts, your role as a teacher is to maintain comity and civility and make sure that the woman wearing the hijab can speak to the colonel from the US military, and they can, and in fact, it happened. You just have to, you're kind of the keeper of the circle, and you're not in a business where you're expressing your always correct and perfect liberal views on every question. I think I think academic freedom by academics is always under very, very important and appropriate disciplinary limitations and classroom limitations. a classroom is not a place for expression. You know, it's not, you know, it's not a performance. I mean, it is a performance, but it's not a performance of your identity. You're doing a job here, and you have tremendously strong responsibilities to your students to make sure that they can be heard and feel respected. And you want to, in fact, encourage disagreement in that frame. I think the second rule, and this is a rule that, being a garrulous old fool, I have sometimes not followed myself, is when academics are called upon to make public commentary on campus and then in the media and other things. The rule of thumb is you only talk about what you damn well know. You know, one of the things that does give universities a bad name, does give experts a justifiably bad name, is people getting up from a university platform and opining about stuff where they actually have done no research, have nothing original to say, and are using the legitimation that they get from being from Cambridge or Oxford or wherever to opine on a public matter where they have no more legitimacy than anybody else. In other words, this is a second example where it seems to me academic freedom requires a great deal of self-discipline, because it's our endless opinionizing about everything that gets people out in the countryside furious. And the Brexit story is a recent story of that, where every time an academic got up, said, well, only idiots would want to vote to leave the European Union. After a while, the idiots out there said, I'm tired of being called an idiot, thank you very much. And besides, you don't know anything about Huddersfield. You don't know anything about these places, right? So there's a kind of democratic obligation to stick to what you know here. And we have paid a very heavy price in university life for having opinions about everything. And so in these two cases, academic freedom can only survive if we perform our roles with an attention to the roles and with a deep sense of responsibility to knowledge.
Thanks, Michael. Jamil.
There's some other questions here.
Not much to ask. Just one example that I came across a few years back about, you know, that life on campus is not only physical interaction, which we miss so much now. And I remember in Pakistan, this philosophy professor telling me that for her, doing online class, which helped kind of communication that would not take place within the classroom, where, for example, girls arguing with boys would not be seen as proper in the society. But online, I'm not talking about social media, but having the opportunity to express their opinion online would enrich the debate and allow everybody to express themselves, which would have been more difficult within the classroom. And of course, this is very culturally linked. We, you know, in the West and especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, we have the tradition of public debate, etc., which may not be so common in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Jamil. I'd like to actually maybe change it up a little bit. We have a question from Manzoor Khan, who is from a private university in Bangladesh, and raises a question which is about the disruption that COVID has affected in higher education. So this really goes to Jamil's assessment of the landscape in which we find ourselves right now. The question here is really about the particular crisis of this university in Bangladesh, in the sense that one consequence of COVID has been a massive drop-off in student numbers and in the prospect of students coming to university. And so the question here is whether you have any thoughts about a post-COVID strategic action plan for dealing with this kind of unprecedented situation, in which there's been an interruption to the progress of young people from the culture at large into the universities. Is it reversible? And I suppose, are there any suggestions for ways of approaching that? Jamil?
Yes, it's definitely this crisis is very unique in many ways, and in previous experiences, we see that when there was, for example, after the 2007-8 financial crisis, you would see a surge in demand for higher education. Notably, if you look at Canada and the US, for example, for college, but this time around, this is not happening. On the contrary, we see a decrease in the demand for places, even for in these institutions where the cost is not so high. And what I observe around the world is that you have a switch to either the most prestigious private universities in countries, for example, in Latin America, where private higher education is very prevalent, or you have a move towards free higher education in public universities in countries where you had fees, because we have to recognize that this crisis has impacted, it's a sanitary crisis, but it's also a huge economic crisis. And if the students if their family has lose their jobs and their income, that will make it much more difficult. And I can understand the struggle of this private university that I'm familiar with in Bangladesh. I think it's going to affect the pipeline from secondary school, and it's when with graduates finding it difficulty to get a job, and we already see statistics from many countries. Students are going to think twice about going to university. Another phenomenon that we see in the US, I don't know, Michael, whether the same thing is happening in Canada. As the economy is restarting, we see higher salaries for high school graduates who are tempted not to study because, all of a sudden they have a job and resources. So I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but definitely it's not like previous crises we are familiar with. And again, universities have to rethink their model. When you charge high fees, as is the case of private universities, do you want to do more to attract low-income students, to have scholarships or student loans to offer zero cost for them, at least while they are studying? I think that in many cases, the economic model was not sustainable, and the crisis has made it much more apparent that it has to be rethought.
Michael, would you like to jump in on this one?
No, I think in the interest of getting to questions, I think I'll pass. Jamil's done a great job.
Great. Well, I'll move on. There's an interesting question from Abdel El Zaim about internationalization. He writes, I suppose the question is really about one dimension of internationalization being the arrival on campuses of students from different parts of the world. The question points us towards the sort of the complement to that, I suppose, which is the way in which education should be internationalized for domestic students, because, of course, in many cases, those students are unable to travel. So the question is prompting us to think a bit about how we equip students for a life in an international setting. That vast majority of students, that is, who remain at home unable to travel. Any thoughts about that, Michael?
Well, I'd shift the frame slightly to make an observation which I hope resonates with lots of people on this call, which is visa regimes and vaccination regimes are now front and center in everybody's awareness on universities, and especially if you have an international student body. I've had to take on a lot of additional people just to get people into Vienna, because the vaccination regimes then connect to visa regimes. I mean, the authorities tell you, no, we make visa regulations separately, but it all gets clotted together. In other words, the model of vastly expanding, internationalizing university education depended on an era of cheap travel, easy visas, and public health conditions which we can't recover. And I think this is going to affect all of our model. How do we respond to this relates to the Bangladesh question. You know, a university like ours, which basically is a small classroom, intensive learning, on-site kind of university, is having to look much more seriously at a permanent online presence, because it just may be the case that we can't get the kid from Nepal. We can't get him here. We can't get the wonderful student from Nigeria. They just won't let him in. And there's no amount, you know, so we then have to have an online presence that I don't think we were thinking about before. And then we have to think, as you're all thinking about, how do we make sure the online presence is as good an experience as we can possibly do. But conversely, the other effect of COVID on all of us is, and I'm sure you all feel this, is just a hunger to get back to the university as a physical place. I mean, all of us as university leaders, our first job is to keep the community together, to keep it functioning as a community in which we bump into each other in the hall, we go out for a drink together, we share meals in the canteen, and we miss that. And it's tremendously fragmenting of our communities. And I think that's our challenge. In other words, a double challenge out of COVID is to maintain the physical community, and on the other hand, reach out with online resources to sustain the internationalization of students that we may not be able to sustain now because of new visa and COVID restrictions.
Thanks, Michael. Jamil.
Yes, if I may comment on this, I think there is a positive side that I see with what we have experienced with COVID. You know, if I'm not talking so much about international students who go for a degree program to abroad, but mobility students, which were still a minority. I mean, perhaps in Western Europe with the Bologna, or in Europe, more generally with the Bologna process, you have a higher proportion of students, but still, you know, for many countries, the proportion of students who have the opportunity to do mobility was really small, and it was an elitist dimension because of the cost of international travel. I think with the COVID crisis, we have realized many universities have put in place very innovative internationalization at home and virtual internationalization. One example is this association of the Pacific Rim universities that bring universities together from Pacific, Asia, and North America and South America. And they have explored mirror classrooms and virtual weeks. And I think that has opened opportunity for a larger number of share of students. And when we are able to go back to physical presence, we shouldn't lose that dimension, that opportunity to democratize internationalization. Because I think when I remember my own experience doing a master in the US, of course, I went to a good university, I had great professors, but what I really enjoyed was this opportunity for 2 years to interact with students from all over the world. And I think to learn to appreciate the cultures that we're not familiar with, to listen to other ideas, other approaches, and I think that's how you build tolerance, and that's an important part of the curriculum that universities should have all over the world.
Thanks, Jamil. We're almost out of time for questions. Perhaps I'll exert my chair's prerogative and ask the last one. And that really has to do, it goes back to a point Michael made about George Soros's rationale for establishing a university anew, as opposed to building upon a university which has history. And you had, I think you've both spoken about the different ways in which universities are cut off from their old ways of doing things, partly by COVID and other factors. I'm interested in whether you have any thoughts for people on the call about how to manage that. Very few institutions are able to erase the past and build again. So how do you negotiate in this time of transition an institution through that kind of transformation from its assumptions of the past to the assumptions it would like to see govern its operations in the future. So just some closing thoughts about that question. Jamil, how about you?
Thank you, Patrick. I think Michael, as a leader of an institution, is better placed than me to respond. But what I have observed over COVID is that leadership makes such a huge difference. And leadership is not only having the title of vice chancellor or president or rector of a university. Leadership is about caring and showing that you care about the community. It's about delegating. It's about empowering people. It's about seeking feedback. It's about leading by example. And I think that's true leaders who have emerged even more strongly during this crisis will hopefully be also able to inspire the community in rethinking some of the dimensions that we have been discussing here about their education model, about their economic model, and most importantly, about the social commitments that universities should have, the role, not being the ivory tower. There is a whole movement to think about the sustainable development goals, and many universities have really been pioneers in that and trying to think about innovative ways of engaging with society and bringing that back into the curriculum and the learning experience of the students. So for me, that's how I envisage universities being able to emerge slightly different from the COVID-19 cocoon.
Thank you, Jamil. Michael.
It's difficult to follow Jamil here. I just have a feeling that he's referred to leadership, and I think one of the things that makes university leadership so different is it is just unlike leadership of a political party or of a company or a corporation. It's just completely unlike it. You can actually be a rather indifferent administrator and be an inspirational leader because you somehow capture the goals of the institution and express those goals and galvanize people to be excited and believe in those goals. And the goals are so exalted. They're about training citizens to be fearless, to be inquiring, to think for themselves. They're about sustaining democratic freedom if you've got it, and working towards academic democratic freedom if you don't. And I know that there are some people on the call who are in countries that are tormented by this. They don't have stable democracies. They're struggling in or out of tyranny. And universities have a tremendously important role there to be examples of freedom in societies that are not free. And then in societies that are free, universities have a tremendously important example to, as I said earlier, to maintain a space for freedom, to maintain a space for honest discussion. The thing that's been brought home to me doing my job has been two things. The world listens to universities. We have an extraordinary authority to platform and validate ideologies, opinions, persons, and this authority is at the moment very heavily contested by our society. They're asking which history is true, which past is the right and correct path, and we're in the center of a vital democratic debate about who we are and what values a democratic society needs to sustain. This is what makes university leadership so different. And as everybody knows on this call, we're herding cats. I mean, it's not as if the people that we command are in line obedience to our commands. They're independent entrepreneurials, fiercely convinced of the rightness of their opinions, and leading this kind of group and keeping a space open so that these explosive talents that we try and manage don't blow the place up is a pretty exciting challenge. And my sense here coming out of this is the crucial centrality of universities to a lively democracy. Montesquieu talked 2.5 centuries ago about les corps intermédiaires. That is, democracy is not just majority rule. It's not just minority rights. It's not just constitutional safeguards. It is also independent self-governing institutions. And we need to remember this at every moment. We're among the oldest self-governing institutions in the world. Some universities around the world are over 1,000 years old. This is an extraordinary achievement, this aspect of self-government. And the self-government permits us to be free, and then we have to be responsible in the way we use our freedom. So, big job.
Michael, thanks. A great note on which to end. I want to thank both of you very much for a really wonderful session, very thought-provoking, and a great way to begin the conference. So I'll now do what is the most awkward part of any Zoom conference. I'll invite everyone to give you a round of applause or in some way signal their gratitude to you.
Thank you.
So thanks very much. We're going to bring this session to a close with 2 videos presenting university values in action. These are videos from 2 of our signatory universities, the University of Sydney in Australia and the University of Alcalá in Spain. So that'll be followed by a short break, I think for half an hour, and we will reconvene.
The University of Sydney was a founding signatory of the Magna Carta Universitatum in Bologna in 1988. Today, 33 years on, we proudly reaffirm our commitment to the fundamental principles on which universities are based. The way that universities worldwide have contributed to the global effort to combat the coronavirus is but one example of the remarkable service they provide to the pursuit of knowledge and truth. It also reflects the enduring importance of university autonomy and the free exchange of ideas without undue hindrance by national borders. The University of Sydney recently reaffirmed its commitment to protecting and upholding the founding principles on which it was established in 1850. By releasing an updated Charter of freedom of speech and academic freedom. Our Charter declares our commitment to these freedoms as fundamental to the conduct of a democratic society and to the ongoing quest for intellectual, moral, and material advances in the human condition. Our Charter recognises that as an institution and community, we greatly value courage and civility and always seek to foster a climate where people can disagree well. As Australia's first university, we also acknowledge the ancient learning cultures and traditions of the Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands our campuses sit. I'm delighted to join with hundreds of university leaders around the world in signing the Magna Carta Universitatum in 2020. By doing so, we seek to strengthen the vital role that universities will continue to play in the global effort to preserve the planet and advance learning, health, prosperity, and enlightenment.
As signatories of the Magna Carta Universitatum at Universidad de Alcalá, we continue to defend the fundamental principles to which we ascribed in 1988 and which we still believe are valid. Independence from all political influence or economic interests, and a strong social commitment based on an open dialogue and the rejection of all intolerance. At Universidad de Alcalá, one of the oldest in Europe and one of the 5 universities declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, we firmly believe in our commitment to knowledge, and we are aware of our role to understand and solve the challenges that humanity faces. Since our foundation, more than 500 years ago, we vindicate the humanistic and universal spirit of the university. We are convinced that, in addition to training good professionals, it is necessary to cultivate critical intelligence and provide comprehensive education so that future generations develop as free people and successfully face any challenge. We are undoubtedly committed to innovation, sustainability, and the development of lines of research that contribute to the growth of science and that give response to social needs. We make a great effort to remain an outstanding center of excellence, an institution in which history and avant-garde go hand in hand, independent, inclusive, close, and open to all trends and sources of knowledge.